An immigrant helped an old woman cross the street, leading to a remarkable reunion. The words echoed in Elian's mind as he stared at the crumpled newspaper clipping from 23 years ago, its edges worn thin from countless readings. How could such a simple act, something he barely remembered now, have altered the course of so many lives? The paper trembled in his weathered hands as he tucked it back into his wallet. 23 years, and here he was, returning to where it all began. Boston in November felt colder than he remembered. The bitter wind cut through his thin jacket, a harsh reminder that he hadn't prepared properly for this homecoming. Elian pulled his collar higher, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the gray afternoon. At 52, his body felt the cold more acutely than it had when he'd first arrived in this country as a 29-year-old carrying nothing but a single suitcase and fading hopes. Traffic rushed past him, the cars blurring into streaks of color against the urban landscape. The sounds were at once familiar and foreign. Honking horns, snatches of English conversations, the distant wail of a siren. He'd spent 7 years of his life here, yet returning now made him feel like a stranger all over again. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Another message from Sophia. "Did you find it yet, Papa? Send a picture when you do." His daughter's enthusiasm warmed him despite the cold. He texted back with fumbling fingers. "Not yet, mi corazón." Soon. Elian continued walking, his eyes scanning street signs until he reached the intersection he'd been searching for. Commonwealth Avenue and Gloucester Street. The corner looked different now. Modernized storefronts, new traffic patterns. The old newspaper stand replaced by a sleek coffee shop. But the crosswalk remained. White lines painted across the same asphalt where, 23 years ago, he had made a decision that took only seconds but resonated across decades. He closed his eyes, letting memory wash over him. 23 years earlier, Elian Navarro stood at the same intersection, though he didn't know its name then. 3 months in America, and the street still confused him. The language still tangled on his tongue. The job interview had gone poorly, his 5th rejection in 2 weeks. His English wasn't good enough, they said. No relevant experience, they said. Always polite smiles that didn't reach their eyes as they shuffled his resume into a drawer he knew would never be opened again. The February wind had been even colder then, cutting through his second-hand suit jacket, the only decent clothing he owned. In his pocket, $27.43, enough for another week of ramen noodles and perhaps 1 more month's rent in the cramped room he shared with 2 other immigrants if he could find some kind of work. Any work by then. Hunger gnawed at his stomach. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's meager breakfast, saving his money for more important things, like the international calling card that let him speak to his pregnant wife, Carmen, still waiting in Bogota until he could save enough to bring her to Boston. The light turned green, and Elian stepped forward mechanically, his mind calculating how many more rejections he could endure before his dream of building a life in America crumbled completely. That's when he noticed her, an elderly woman at the curb, her cane tapping tentatively at the edge as pedestrians rushed past without a glance. She wore a heavy wool coat that seemed too large for her small frame, a purple scarf wrapped around her neck and covering silver-white hair. Her hand trembled as she gripped her cane, hesitation evident in every movement as she peered at the crossing signal already beginning to blink its warning. Elian paused mid-stride. In his culture, you didn't ignore your elders when they needed help. No matter how bad things were, his mother had taught him better than that. "Necesita ayuda?" he asked automatically, then caught himself. "Do you need help?" His English came out stilted and heavily accented. The woman turned roomy blue eyes toward him, relief washing over her wrinkled face. "Oh yes. Thank you, young man. These crossings get shorter every year, or perhaps I get slower." Her voice had a musical quality despite its age-worn edges. Without further conversation, Elian gently offered his arm, which she took with a grateful nod. He adjusted his pace to her slow, careful steps, hyper-aware of the crossing signal counting down. Other pedestrians flowed around them like water around stones in a stream, some casting impatient glances, others completely oblivious. "My grandson usually helps me, but he's sick today," she explained, her cane tapping a counterpoint to their slow progress. "I didn't want to miss my weekly chess game at the park. Been going for 30 years. Elian nodded, struggling to understand her rapid English. He caught perhaps every third word, piecing together meaning through context in her expressive hands. They were only halfway across when the signal began to flash more urgently. "We should hurry," he suggested, anxiety creeping into his voice. The woman tightened her grip on his arm. "I can't go any faster, dear." "Don't worry. They won't run us over," She chuckled, seemingly unconcerned with the impatient drivers now waiting for them. Elian felt his heart racing. The vulnerable feeling of being caught in the middle of traffic, bringing back memories of his first days in this foreign land. Exposed, uncertain, at the mercy of rules he didn't fully understand. When they finally reached the opposite curb, the woman patted his arm gratefully. "Thank you. My name is Margaret Williams." She looked up at him with unexpected intensity. "And you are?" "Elian Navarro." He shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny, wondering if he had somehow done something wrong. "Colombian?" she asked, surprising him. He nodded, eyes widening slightly. "I taught Spanish literature for 40 years before retiring," she explained, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "I recognize the accent." "Where are you headed, Mr. Navarro?" The question caught him off guard. He wasn't headed anywhere specific anymore, just away from another rejection. "No place. Just walking." Margaret studied him for a long moment, her blue eyes seeming to read every worry line on his face, every frayed thread on his jacket. "Well, since you're not busy, would you care to join me? My chess partner makes the most wonderful empanadas. His wife was from Mexico, God rest her soul. He always brings extra." The mention of empanadas made Elian's stomach contract painfully. How long had it been since he'd tasted anything from home? The homesickness hit him with unexpected force, a wave of longing for familiar tastes, sounds, and faces. "I don't play chess," he admitted. Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that transformed her entire face. "Then it's the perfect time to learn, isn't it?" Something in her manner, the gentle authority of a lifelong teacher, made refusal seem impossible. Besides, the promise of food was too tempting, and the alternative was another afternoon alone in his cold room, staring at dwindling funds and fading hopes. "Okay," he agreed hesitantly. "I will come." He couldn't have known then that this simple acceptance would alter the trajectory of his life, that Margaret Williams was about to become the most unexpected blessing in his American journey. Part 1. The chess players gathered in a secluded corner of the public garden, at tables sheltered from the worst of the wind by carefully placed barriers. Despite the February chill, at least a dozen elderly men and women huddled over chessboards, their focus so complete they barely noticed the cold. Margaret introduced Elian to her regular opponent, a barrel-chested man in his 70s named Howard, who greeted him with a firm handshake and assessing eyes. "Found yourself a bodyguard, Maggie?" Howard joked, his voice gruff but friendly. "A gentleman," she corrected, settling herself on the bench with practiced care. "Something you could learn about, Howard." Their banter continued as they set up the chess pieces, clearly a routine decades in the making. Elian stood awkwardly to the side until Margaret patted the bench beside her. "Sit, watch, learn," she instructed. "Howard has been trying to beat me for 20 years. And coming damn close lately," Howard grumbled, though his eyes twinkled. He reached into a bag beside him and produced a container, which he opened to reveal golden brown empanadas. The scent wafted up, a mixture of spices and pastry that made Elian's throat tighten with emotion. Howard pushed the container toward him. "Eat. You look like you need it more than these old vultures." He gestured to the other chess players with a grin. Elian hesitated only briefly before taking one, trying to maintain his dignity despite the hunger clawing at him. The first bite brought an involuntary sound of pleasure. The flavors not exactly like home, but close enough to trigger a flood of memories. He closed his eyes briefly, transported back to his mother's kitchen in Bogota. When he opened his eyes, he found Margaret watching him with a knowing expression. "Food from home is powerful medicine," she said quietly as Howard contemplated his opening move. "When was the last time you called your family, Elian?" The question, asked so directly yet with such compassion, caught him off guard. "Yesterday," he answered. "My wife, she is having a baby in 3 months. I try to call every few days." Margaret nodded, her attention seemingly divided between him and the chessboard where Howard had just moved his knight. "And how long have you been in Boston?" "Then 3 months." He took another bite of empanada, savoring it, making it last. She moved her pawn, then turned those perceptive blue eyes back to him. "Finding work?" The simple question pierced straight through his carefully maintained facade. Elian looked down, shame washing over him. "Not yet," Howard snorted without looking up from the board. "Economy's garbage right now." "Not your fault, son." Margaret shot Howard a look before returning her attention to Elian. "What did you do back in Colombia?" "I was an accountant for a shipping company." The words felt hollow now, his education and experience rendered worthless by a language barrier and foreign credentials. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly as she contemplated Howard's latest move. "Check," she said to Howard before turning back to Elian. "My nephew Daniel runs a small accounting firm. They do a lot of work with businesses in the Latin community." Elian felt a flicker of interest, quickly suppressed. He learned not to hope too quickly. "My English ... It's not good enough yet. Your Spanish, however, is excellent." Margaret countered with a small smile. "And that's precisely what Daniel needs. Someone who can communicate with his Spanish-speaking clients. The English will come with time and practice." Howard moved his king out of check. "Maggie doesn't make offers lightly," he commented, eyes still on the board. "She taught half of Boston's elite, including the mayor. People listen when she talks." Elian's heart beat faster despite his efforts to remain calm. "You would do this for me? Why? You don't know me." Margaret's move was decisive, placing Howard in check again. "I know enough. I've been teaching for over 40 years, Mr. Navajo. I can recognize character." She finally looked away from the chessboard, fixing him with those intelligent blue eyes. "Besides, my husband was an immigrant too, from Greece. People helped him, and now I help others. That's how it should work." Elian swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. "Thank you," he managed. Margaret nodded, then turned back to the game. "It's just an introduction, nothing more. What you make of it will be up to you." She moved her queen. "Checkmate, Howard." Howard groaned dramatically, though his eyes showed only affection. "One of these days, Maggie. One of these days." As they packed up the chess set, Margaret wrote down an address and phone number on a slip of paper. "Monday morning, 9 o'clock. Ask for Daniel Williams. Tell him his Aunt Maggie sent you." She pressed the paper into Elian's hand. "Don't be late." That Monday had changed everything. Daniel Williams, a serious man in his 40s with his aunt's penetrating gaze, had interviewed Elian for 20 minutes, tested his accounting knowledge, and hired him on the spot as a part-time assistant focusing on Spanish-speaking clients. "Your English needs work," Daniel had said frankly, "but your accounting skills are solid, and we need someone who can make our Latino clients feel comfortable. Aunt Maggie says you're trustworthy, and that's good enough for me." The part-time position became full-time within 3 months. By summer, Elian had saved enough to rent a small apartment. By fall, Carmen had joined him, her belly round with their child. And every Tuesday, without fail, Elian would take his lunch hour to visit the public garden and watch Margaret and Howard play chess, gradually learning the game himself. When Sophia was born in late October, Margaret was among their first visitors, arriving with a handmade blanket and a worn copy of Don Quixote in Spanish. For when she's older, Margaret had said, placing the book on the nightstand, "Every child should know the classics of their heritage." Over the following 4 years, Margaret became like family, Abuela Maggie. To little Sophia, a mentor to Elian as he improved his English, and a friend to Carmen as she adjusted to American life. The Williams family embraced them, inviting them to Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas celebrations, helping them navigate the complexities of American society. It was Margaret who encouraged Elian to apply for his CPA certification, tutoring him in English until he could pass the exam. It was Margaret who convinced Carmen to pursue her dream of opening a small bakery specializing in Colombian pastries. And it was Margaret who stood as godmother when their second child, a boy they named Miguel, was born. For 4 precious years, their lives intertwined in a tapestry of friendship that transcended age, culture, and background. Until the phone call that changed everything again. "Oh, no. A stroke," Daniel explained, his voice tight with emotion over the phone. "She's stable, but it's not good, Elian. The doctors say there might be permanent damage." Elian clutched the receiver, Carmen watching his face with concern from across their small living room. "Which hospital?" he asked, already reaching for his coat. But the next words froze him in place. "She's not here, Elian. Her sister in Seattle. Aunt Maggie made the decision to move there for long-term care. They left yesterday." Yesterday. The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "But why didn't she tell us? Why didn't she say goodbye?" The silence on the other end stretched before Daniel finally spoke. "You know how she is. Proud. She didn't want to fuss, didn't want you all to see her diminished." The news hit like a physical blow. Margaret, vibrant, intelligent Margaret, had simply vanished from their lives without warning, without a chance for proper goodbyes. Elian thought of Sophia, now 4, who would ask for her Abuela Maggie. How could he explain? "Will she come back?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "I don't think so, Elian. The care facility in Seattle is near her sister's home. It's probably for the best." They received 3 letters over the next 6 months. Margaret's handwriting growing progressively shakier, her once sharp thoughts occasionally wandering mid-sentence. Then the letter stopped. Daniel explained that her condition had worsened, that she sometimes didn't recognize even her closest family members anymore. Life continued. Elian's career flourished at Daniel's firm. Carmen's bakery gained a loyal following. Sophia started school, and Miguel grew from infant to toddler. But Margaret's absence remained an unhealed wound, a chapter closed too abruptly. Then came the economic collapse of 2008. Daniel's firm struggled as clients cut costs. Carmen's bakery barely survived. By 2010, facing mounting debts and diminishing prospects, they made the painful decision to leave Boston for Miami, where Carmen's cousin offered Elian a position in his growing business in affordable housing until they could get back on their feet. The move meant leaving the Williams family behind, another goodbye that tore at Elian's heart. Daniel promised to stay in touch, but lives diverged, communications became sporadic, and eventually faded entirely. Seattle remained a distant city where Margaret lived out her final years. Unreachable, a treasured memory rather than a continuing presence. Or so Elian had believed, until last week's phone call from a law office had upended everything he thought he knew. Present day. The coffee shop on the corner, previously the newspaper stand where Elian had once stopped daily, was warm and fragrant as he stepped inside, grateful to escape the November chill. He ordered a black coffee and chose a table near the window, overlooking the intersection where he'd first met Margaret 23 years ago. The lawyer had been specific about the meeting place and time. 3 o'clock. The coffee shop at Commonwealth in Gloucester. Someone will be there who very much wants to meet you, Mr. Navarro. Elian checked his watch. 2:47. His stomach knotted with anticipation and uncertainty. The lawyer had refused to provide details, saying only that it concerned Margaret Williams and matters related to her estate. Elian had assumed it was some delayed notification, perhaps a small bequest discovered after her passing. But the phrasing had been odd. Someone wants to meet you. Who? Daniel, perhaps? They hadn't spoken in nearly a decade. The coffee warmed his hands as he stared out at the crosswalk, memories flowing through him like the pedestrians crossing back and forth. Sophia was 22 now, in her final year of university studying literature, influenced no doubt by the books Margaret had read to her as a child. Miguel, 19, was pursuing computer science. Carmen had rebuilt her bakery business in Miami, more successful than ever. And Elian himself had eventually started his own accounting practice serving immigrant communities. All of it, every success, every opportunity, traced back to that February afternoon when he'd offered his arm to an elderly woman at a crosswalk. The bell above the coffee shop door jingled. Elian looked up automatically, then froze, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. An elderly woman stood in the doorway, leaning on a polished wooden cane. Her white hair was cut in a stylish bob, her posture slightly stooped, but still carrying a hint of the dignified bearing he remembered. Different from his memories, older, frailer, but unmistakably her. Margaret Williams, alive. Their eyes met across the coffee shop, and recognition flashed between them like lightning. Immediate, electric, undeniable. Elian rose slowly to his feet, coffee forgotten, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were seeing. Margaret moved toward him with careful steps, her free hand clutching the arm of a middle-aged woman who supported her with practiced ease. Elian Navarro, Margaret said when she reached his table, her voice thinner than he remembered but with that same musical quality. Still rushing to help old ladies across streets? A laugh burst from him, half joy and half shock, as tears sprang to his eyes. Margaret, they told me, we thought, he stumbled over words in both languages, that I was dead. Her eyes twinkled with that familiar intelligence. Not quite yet, though not for lack of trying. She gestured to the chair opposite him. May I? Elian hurried to pull out the chair, helping her settle into it as the woman accompanying her, a caregiver he realized, stepped back discreetly. How? It was all he could manage. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. Her skin felt paper thin, the bones delicate beneath, but her grip was surprisingly firm. A long story with many gaps even I can't fill, she said. The stroke was bad, Elian. Very bad. I lost so much, memories, language, mobility. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Seattle was necessary. My sister was a doctor, and the facility there was experimental, focused on stroke recovery. Elian nodded, still struggling to believe she sat before him, real and alive. First few years are mostly darkness. Margaret continued. I'm told I didn't recognize anyone, couldn't speak, needed care for everything. Her mouth tightened momentarily. Not how I'd planned to spend my 70s. Daniel told us communication became impossible. Elian said softly. We sent letters, but I never received them, Margaret confirmed. My condition was kept very private. My sister was protective. Too protective, perhaps. Only immediate family was permitted to visit. The caregiver stepped forward with a glass of water, which Margaret accepted with a nod of thanks. 5 years ago, something changed. She continued after taking a sip. New treatments, new therapies, perhaps just time. The doctors aren't entirely sure. But I began to improve. Memories returned in fragments. Speech came back, though not without effort. She gestured to herself with a wry smile. Not quite the Margaret you knew, but more of her than anyone expected to see again. Elian felt tears tracking down his cheeks, unashamed. Why didn't Daniel tell us? Daniel didn't know, not until recently, Margaret explained. My sister kept my improvement private, fearing setbacks. She passed away last year, and her daughter, my niece, took over my care. She found my journals where I'd been practicing my writing by recording old memories. Margaret's eyes grew bright. I wrote about a Colombian accountant who helped an old woman across the street, about chess games in the park, about a little girl named Sophia who loved Don Quixote. Elian's throat tightened. You remembered us. Fragments at first. Then more. My niece started searching, found Daniel, who told her you'd moved to Miami. The rest required some detective work. She smiled. Fortunately, you've made quite a name for yourself in accounting circles, Mr. Navajo. Not difficult to track down. The impossibility of the moment overwhelmed him. Margaret Williams, his Margaret, Sophia's abuela Maggie, sitting across from him after 13 years, after he'd mourned her and carried her memory like a precious stone in his heart. Sophia will be... She won't believe. He couldn't complete the thought. Margaret's eyes lit up. Sophia, how is she? And Carmen? And little Miguel, who wasn't so little even then? Sophia is studying literature at university. Miguel is in computer science. Carmen's bakery in Miami is the best in the neighborhood. The words tumbled out. They're flying up tomorrow. I came ahead to, well, I didn't know I was coming to meet you. The lawyer just said, ah, yes, that. Margaret straightened slightly. I had to be certain you would come, and lawyers do sound so official and important. She smiled mischievously. There are some legal matters, a small trust I've established for Sophia and Miguel's education. But mostly, Elian, I wanted to see you, to thank you. Thank me? Elian shook his head in confusion. Margaret, I owe you everything. My career, our life in America, it all started because you helped me. Margaret's eyes grew serious. Did Daniel never tell you? I'd stopped going to the park after my husband died. For months, I barely left my apartment. That day you helped me cross the street. It was my first time venturing out alone in nearly a year. Her voice softened. You didn't just help an old woman across the street, Elian. You helped me find my way back to living. The revelation left him speechless, understanding blooming that what he'd always seen as Margaret's kindness toward him had been, in its own way, a mutual salvation. We helped each other, he finally said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, she squeezed his hand. And now if you're willing, I'd like to meet your family again. To see Sophia and Miguel. To thank Carmen for the holiday cookies she used to bring me. Margaret's eyes grew misty. I've missed so many years, Elian. I can't get them back. But perhaps we can make new memories while there's still time. Elian nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Outside the window, pedestrians crossed back and forth, each intersection of lives containing possibilities no one could foresee. How many life-altering moments happened every day on street corners around the world? How many hands reached out? How many kindnesses offered without knowledge of what might follow? I'll call them right now. He managed finally. They'll want to change their flights, come sooner. Margaret smiled, settling back in her chair. Tell them I still have their copy of Don Quixote, and that I expect a full report on Sophia's literature studies. Her eyes twinkled. After all, I was a professor before I was an abuela. As Elian reached for his phone, his fingers brushed against the old newspaper clipping in his wallet. The headline that had caught his eye in a Miami library archive during a research project 3 years ago, preserved now as a talisman of sorts. An immigrant helped an old woman cross the street, leading to a remarkable reunion. The small local story, buried in the Boston Herald's community section decades ago, had featured a photo of them at the chess tables, Margaret, Howard, and himself, accompanied by a brief human interest piece about intergenerational friendship and immigrant integration. He'd had no idea it existed until he found it by chance, long after he believed Margaret was gone. Now looking at her across the table, older, changed, but undeniably present, Elian understood that some connections were too profound to be severed by time or distance, or even stroke. Some acts of kindness continued to reverberate through decades, creating ripples that returned in ways no one could predict. Outside, the Boston afternoon began transitioning toward evening, the streetlights flickering on as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall. Inside the warm coffee shop, two friends who had once lost each other prepared to build a bridge across the years that had separated them, proving that sometimes the most remarkable reunions come when we least expect them, born from the simplest acts of human kindness. 3 days later, the small gathering at Daniel's home hummed with conversation and laughter. Sophia, now a poised young woman with her mother's eyes and her father's thoughtful expression, sat beside Margaret on the sofa, their heads bent over a leather-bound book. Miguel demonstrated his latest programming project to Howard, who at 94 remained sharp-minded despite his weathered appearance. Carmen and Daniel's wife exchanged recipes in the kitchen, the scent of Colombian coffee mingling with baking apple pie. Elian stood in the doorway, watching it all with a fullness in his heart that threatened to overflow. 23 years ago, he had been lost, alone, a stranger in a strange land. Now he was surrounded by family, both blood and chosen, in a tapestry of connections that had withstood separation, distance, and time. Margaret looked up, catching his eye across the room. Her smile held the wisdom of her 91 years and the warmth that had changed his life decades ago. Elian, she called, patting the space beside her. Sophia's telling me about her thesis on magical realism. Come listen. You won't believe how brilliant your daughter is. As he crossed the room to join them, Elian reflected that perhaps the most magical reality was this one, where a simple act of helping an elderly woman across a street could unfold into a lifetime of unexpected blessings, separations, and finally joyful reunions. Some might call it coincidence, others fate. Elian preferred to think of it as the natural outcome of human kindness. How reaching out a hand in one moment could eventually, miraculously, lead to someone reaching back when you needed it most. Outside, snow continued to fall in Boston, covering the crosswalks and intersections in a clean white blanket, ready for new footprints, new journeys, new stories of connection waiting to unfold.